Thank you. I must now look to see if my technology will work. In the African tradition, this will be a brief oral presentation. This was a very challenging panel of commission on the decolonization of the mind and self-reinvention. It was a commission engagement that defies the normal kinds of discussions that we have in our global conferences, because it touched to the very humanity of our communities, both on the African continent as well as in the diaspora. It was wrenching in many ways and brought some people nearly to tears. One of the reasons and an implication for future conferences is that our commission was comprised of 4 individuals, 3 of whom are from the diaspora, one of those 3 who has lived on the continent of Africa for the last 15 years. And therefore, the emotional calculation of how we approach the subject was somewhat imbalanced. We'd have African descendants in the United States who talked about the pain, the sense of loss, the sense of disconnection, the sense of being unrooted, because they do not feel, as a result of the history of slavery and of colonization, that they are connected anywhere, or that they are really received well on the continent of Africa. Those are critical reflections, not criticisms, that we should consider when we put together a panel. There were Africans born on the continent, living on the continent, who were also brought nearly to tears in their statement of feeling the pain and the disconnection of this. On the issue of decolonization, we talked broadly about 2 perspectives. One was at the very personal level of decolonizing our minds. Martin Luther King, the great civil rights leader in the United States, who was a global human rights leader, said, "We are Africans and we should never forget it, but nor should the Africans." One of the implications of that statement is that the history of Pan-Africanism did not start on the African continent. It started in the Caribbean. It started by radical thinkers who felt very, very deeply about the colonization process and their responsibility for joining with Africans on the continent to liberate themselves. But let us remember that those Africans coming out of the Caribbean and then into the United States, who started the process of decolonization with Africans on the continent, also talked about the people of the Mediterranean Sea. W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903, when he wrote The Souls of Black Folk, talking about the most impoverished and downtrodden descendants of Africans in the United States of America, who said, "I am also talking about the colored people of the world who have been colonized." What are the implications of that for the decolonization of the mind? Africa is the cradle of the birth of humanity. There is a tendency to talk about Africans and the African descendants from the point of view of our deficits, the sense that we feel inferior. But we brought humanity to the world, and there is no parallel universe that somehow we will fill up our pain, overcome our pain, by staying outside of the larger structures of the world. If the world is to be saved, if humanity is to be improved, it will not simply be by us focusing on us. We have to take responsibility for helping to lead the entirety of humanity. This is one of the contexts of that. So in the context of the African Union, there has been much talk, much philosophy, much rhetoric, many, many reports about the 6th region. But where is the evidence of that? The general discussion of decolonization is how we can help Africa. Little discussion about how Africa can materially help the diaspora. And so a case in point that is a very promising signature. South Africa, in defeating apartheid, was not simply interested in liberating Southern Africa. It looked at the Palestinian issue and it said, we have never suffered like the Palestinians have suffered, and we are going to take global leadership responsibility for standing forth and putting forth an ethical and a deep humanistic framework, and we're going to do it at the level of international governance. That is a great, great indication of how Africa can also look at the issues of the diaspora and how Africa, in both its civil society and its governance population, can help uplift. We have Afro-Colombian leaders being killed every day. These are community organizers. Perhaps the most complex diaspora expression on the globe. Palenqueros, they have their own language. Last names Mina, Angola, they know where they come from. But they're not just one Africa. Many of them have collective land bases in which they are responsible for one another. Many of them live in cities as individuals. So there is not one African in terms of the decolonization of the mind. We have many expressions. In the world today, it is estimated that there are approximately 3,000 living languages. 500 of those languages are in Nigeria. There are many expressions of what it is to be an African in Nigeria. 3,000 languages, and this is outside of the fact the largest English-speaking population in the world is not in Europe, it's in India. We are multicultural. It is not just the skin color that we have. We have a lot to work from. So the summary on that point was, we should be careful to define ourselves by our deficits. We should define ourselves by our contribution to our own uplift and security and our contributions to the world. And from that platform, then we should look at our pain and look at our deficits. We are an extraordinary group of educated and committed people here. A second issue that we talked about was African ancestry. So in the United States in particular, and this has implications for the entire world, there are people who are scientifically studying through DNA tests what region of Africa may we have come from. This is a healing process. And one of the recommendations is that within the African Union, we need a structure to help receive Africans who are trying, in the diaspora, who are trying to reestablish their relationship at home. This is fundamentally important because we have a historical experience that was very devastating both to African descendants and to the people who received them. Many African Americans, descendants of slavery in the United States, came to Liberia. It was a disaster because they were not prepared to come home and home was not prepared to receive them. So one of the recommendations is that some kind of structure be set up in the multilateral system across nations. Ghana and others have started that process. Then there is the question of education, of the decolonization of the mind. We talked about the tendency in all of our communities, including on the continent of Africa, to say, we don't know anything about ourselves. That is fundamentally untrue. Over a 10-year period, the general history of Africa in the UNESCO, in which a number of us were involved in, who were the key historians in developing that 10 volumes, including the last volume is on the diaspora? They come from the continent of Africa. They come from the African diaspora. The father of Afro-epistemology, Chucho Garcia, who is the Venezuelan ambassador here in West Africa, is sitting in the audience. We have many, many strengths. Now, there is but one country that we are aware of that has adopted the general history of Africa, and that is Brazil. In Brazil, it is a law that everyone must learn African history. Why is that not the case across the continent of Africa? Why is that not the case across Europe? We have that resource. Europe did not produce that resource for us. We produce that resource for ourselves. So here's another example that we have a foundation to address our pain. We have a foundation to address our deficit. We do have pain, we do have deficits, but we have strong foundations on which to build. The issue of youth. I am 79 years old next month. I look around and I see our seniors. We have extraordinary young geniuses in all of our communities who are producing. We heard one member of our commission, Fabian, who says that the average entrepreneur that they are working with on the continent of Africa is 24 years old. It is time that we open up our spaces, not to open up their heads to tell them what we think, but it is time that we open up our heads and our ears to see the creativity of the youth and have them at the center of gravity as leadership in this process. Let me see if I can conclude by finding my notes here, which I lost on my... Okay. I cannot find the final note. We will write up a narrative on that. Let me just conclude by saying something else about the sixth region. Today, when you look at Brazil, over 100 million Brazilians, 53% of the population, identifying themselves as negro, black, and raça mixta, mixed race, brown-skinned people, different color. The democratic question in Brazil is the African question.
Pourquoi est-ce que nous n'avons pas de représentation en Afrique, un afrodescendant brésilien dans l'Union africaine, dans les sociétés africaines qui seraient co-hôtes des représentants des Africains? C'est une recommandation que nous avons faite également. Les citoyens de la diaspora, vous devez vraiment le faire. Nous ne pouvons pas le faire sans la gouvernance. Il faudra s'identifier. Il faudrait que l'Union africaine reconsidère notre structure. Le Brésil a un nombre considérable d'hommes de couleur, de femmes de couleur, avec des positions de décision ou des postes de décision. Alors Lula qui dit, vous blancs, vous avez c'est des hommes courts, vous avez... Bon, ces personnes comprennent que ce sont des populations qui vivent dans la pauvreté extrême. Alors, il faudra penser à la question de l'Afrique. Hugo Chavez dit, je suis indien, de l'Inde et du Japon, mais je suis noir parce que ma grand-mère était une femme de couleur. Je suis un afro-descendant. Ce n'est pas seulement une philosophie. Qu'a-t-il fait? Il a commencé à identifier les jeunes vénézuéliens de couleur et commencer par les lier à l'Afrique. Nous devons tout faire pour atteindre l'échelle. Je voudrais conclure par ceci. Il est temps que nous commencions à vivre dans ce monde. Selon les rapports, nous sommes à 8 milliards d'habitants et on aurait peut-être également 8 milliards de personnes que nous ne connaissons pas. Nous sommes 1 milliard sur le continent africain et plus de 100 millions au Brésil, des dizaines de millions en Europe. Alors, des gens qui ne viendront jamais vers leurs racines. Mais l'Afrique vit dans leur sang, l'Afrique vit dans leur mentalité. Alors, voilà ce qu'il faut pour faciliter le processus. Ce n'est pas seulement une question d'inviter la diaspora ou d'envoyer des fonds en Afrique en tant que diaspora. Il est temps que l'Afrique envoie sa force, son levier politique à la diaspora. Nous allons tout de suite réécrire un nouveau narratif. Ce ne sera pas facile. Pour ceux qui parlent de la nature humaine. Enfin, nous avons des nôtres éduqués par l'Afrique du Nord. Nous parlons de la civilisation, de la douleur que nous sentons, le besoin en tant qu'afro-descendants. Toutefois, nous vivons dans un système économique mondial qui a un nom. Je ne vais pas tout de suite me mettre à faire un autre discours. Ce système est qualifié. Quelle est la qualité de vie? Quel accès avons-nous à la santé, aux autres systèmes? Nous vivons dans un monde qui est hautement instrumentalisé. Qu'avons-nous pour nous défendre? Pourquoi est-ce que le budget de l'Union africaine provient de l'Europe et non de l'Afrique? L'Afrique est autant riche. L'Afrique dispose des ressources financières pour se soutenir. Et voilà de quoi nous parlons quand nous indexons la décolonisation. Et tout est rationalisé. On parle de l'Afrique, l'Afrique la pauvre, l'Afrique la décharge. L'Union africaine doit jouer sa partition dans ce mécanisme à travailler avec les afro-descendants. Aux Nations Unies, ils disent rendre à l'Amérique sa grandeur, c'est-à-dire que l'Amérique retrouve encore ses blancs, sa religion. Alors, ce que Trump a dit aux Nations Unies il y a de cela 5 semaines, il dit l'immigration détruit la culture de l'Amérique. Au fait, il nous indexait. Nous devons vraiment réfléchir. Et bon, je suis vraiment désolée si j'indexe l'Union africaine. C'est une question de la mondialisation. Merci de votre attention.